The champagne flute never made it to Dean Martin's lips. He was standing in Irving Lazar's Beverly Hills mansion, surrounded by Hollywood's elite on a crystalline December night in 1988, when he heard Roman Polanski's voice cutting through the cocktail chatter like a razor through silk. The director was holding court near the grand piano, entertaining producers and starlets with his trademark cynical wit. But when Polanski started talking about rich boys and their dangerous toys, when he mentioned Dean Paul Martin by name and actually laughed about a father's dead son, the champagne glass in Dean's hand became as still as a gravestone. Every person within 20 feet could feel the temperature drop. They were about to witness something that would end either in blood or legend. The Lazar Christmas party of 1988 was Hollywood royalty in motion. Irving Swifty Lazar's Coldwater Canyon mansion glittered with marble and crystal, hosting the industry's most powerful faces. Warren Beatty, Jack Nicholson, Michael Douglas, titans of entertainment gathering in civilized splendor. Waiters served Dom Perignon, while fortunes were made with handshakes and careers destroyed with whispered words. It was exactly the kind of gathering where Roman Polanski could say something unforgivable and think the sophisticated crowd would let it slide. Dean Martin was 71, but grief had aged him beyond his years. 21 months since Dean Paul died in that F-4 Phantom crash over the San Bernardino Mountains. 21 months of waking up and remembering his son was gone. The boy who had been Dean's pride, his future snuffed out in twisted metal at 35. Dean hadn't wanted to come tonight, but Irving's persistence and his children's urging brought him here, trying to pretend he was still the king of cool, when inside he felt broken. Roman Polanski was 55, wearing his reputation like armor. The Polish director had conquered Hollywood with Rosemary's Baby and Chinatown, but scandal shadowed his brilliance. The 1969 Manson murders that killed his wife Sharon Tate had made him tragic. His 1977 guilty plea involving a minor made him a fugitive living in European exile. Tonight he was back as Lazar's guest, holding court like a returning king, his accent making even cruel observations sound sophisticated. Polanski stood near the piano, brandy in hand, entertaining his audience with European sophistication. He was a natural performer, understanding how to keep people hanging on his words, his voice carrying the authority of genius mixed with bitter experience. "You know," Polanski said, his Polish accent exotic, "I find American attitudes toward risk fascinating. In Europe we understand life is dangerous, but wealthy Americans think money protects them from reality." The circle nodded knowingly. Polanski was building toward something. "Take these rich boys who play with military jets like sports cars," he continued, "flying F-4 Phantoms for thrills, pretending to be pilots when they're spoiled children with expensive toys." His voice carried disdain. "They have no understanding of real combat. To them it's all a game until—" He made a crashing gesture with his hand. Someone laughed nervously. This was heading somewhere dark, but Polanski's genius gave him permission to push boundaries. "I remember that Martin boy," Polanski said, sipping brandy. "Dean Paul, wasn't it? 35 years old, playing soldier in his airplane. The newspapers called it tragedy, but really, what did anyone expect?" He shrugged. "Give a rich American boy a fighter jet and eventually he will find a mountain. Simple mathematics." The circle had gone quiet. This wasn't abstract philosophy anymore. This was about real people, real grief, and Dean Martin was in this house. But Polanski wasn't finished. The attention, the shocked faces, the transgression, it fed something in him. The father built this image of the boy as some hero. Polanski continued mockingly. Military service, patriotic duty, American mythology. But truly, what was he? A rich man's son with dangerous equipment he had no business operating. If he'd worked in his father's nightclub instead of playing Top Gun, he'd still be alive. He paused. But that would have required actual work, wouldn't it? Not the glamorous warrior pilot image. 20 feet away, Dean Martin had stopped moving entirely. He stood frozen near the marble staircase, champagne glass forgotten. Every muscle had gone rigid. His face, usually animated with that trademark lazy smile, had become a mask of stillness. The transformation was so complete that people near him instinctively stepped away, sensing danger. Jack Nicholson, standing nearby, followed Dean's gaze and immediately understood. Jack had known Dean for 20 years, had seen him handle drunks, hecklers and mob bosses with casual aplomb, but he'd never seen Dean look like this, like a predator identifying prey. "Dean," Jack whispered, putting a hand on his friend's arm. "Don't. Not here." Dean didn't acknowledge him. His attention was completely focused on Polanski, who was still entertaining his audience with increasingly vicious observations about American privilege. Polanski had no idea he was being watched. "The irony," Polanski was saying, "is that these rich boys think they're honoring their fathers by playing soldier, but actually, they're just embarrassing them. Can you imagine being Dean Martin, the great entertainer, and having to pretend your son was some war hero, when really he was just a dilettante who got himself killed showing off?" That was the moment. That was the sentence that crossed from crude insensitivity into unforgivable cruelty. In the sophisticated atmosphere of the Lazar party, Roman Polanski had just committed casual viciousness that stunned even Hollywood's jaded elite. Dean Martin began to move. He didn't rush. He didn't storm across the room like an angry father ready to throw punches. Instead, he walked with the same measured pace he'd used on stage for 40 years. He set his champagne glass on a passing waiter's tray. He straightened his tuxedo jacket. He moved through the crowd like smoke, people unconsciously parting. Polanski was still talking when Dean appeared at the edge of his circle. The director was so caught up in his performance that he didn't notice his audience's changed body language. "Roman," Dean said quietly. Polanski turned, and his easy smile faltered when he saw who had joined them. Dean Martin stood there in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, silver hair immaculate, face composed, but his eyes were like winter. "Dean," Polanski said, his voice carrying nervousness. "What a surprise. We were just discussing." "I heard what you were discussing," Dean interrupted. His voice was quiet, conversational, but carried through the sudden silence. "You were talking about my son." The circle around them dissolved as people found urgent reasons to be elsewhere. Nobody wanted to witness what was about to happen, but nobody could look away either. This was the kind of moment that would be discussed in Hollywood for decades. Polanski tried to recover his composure. He'd dealt with angry actors before, with producers who didn't understand his vision. "Dean, I hope you understand I meant no disrespect," Polanski said, his accent making the words sound insincere. "I was simply making an observation about American culture, about the way wealth can shield people from—" "Stop talking," Dean said. The words were delivered so quietly, with such absolute authority, that Polanski's mouth snapped shut involuntarily. Dean took a step closer. "You want to know what my son was?" Dean asked, his voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying to every corner of the nearby space. "He was a captain in the California Air National Guard. He flew combat missions. He served his country with honor and distinction. He could have stayed home, played it safe, used his name to avoid service. Instead, he chose to put his life on the line for something bigger than himself." Dean paused, letting the words sink in. Around them the party continued, but it felt distant, muffled, as if they were standing in the eye of a hurricane. "But you," Dean continued, his gaze never leaving Polanski's face, "you wouldn't understand that kind of courage. You wouldn't understand choosing duty over safety, service over self-interest, because you've spent your entire life running from consequences." The reference to Polanski's fugitive status hung in the air like a sword. Everyone in Hollywood knew the story, knew why Polanski couldn't return to the United States except as a protected guest at exclusive parties. "Dean," Polanski said, his voice strained, "that's completely different. My situation was—" "Your situation," Dean interrupted, "was that you committed a crime and ran away rather than face the consequences. My son flew fighter jets to serve his country. Do you see the difference?" The crowd had grown larger now, drawn by primal instinct that sensed blood in the water. Warren Beatty was watching from near the bar. Michael Douglas had stopped his conversation to stare. Even Irving Lazar himself had emerged to see what was causing the disturbance. Polanski's face had gone pale. He was beginning to understand that this wasn't just an angry father defending his son's memory. This was something much more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose and a talent for public humiliation. Furthermore, Dean continued, his voice growing slightly louder. "You want to talk about spoiled rich boys who get themselves killed through recklessness? Let's talk about your wife." The words hit Polanski like a physical blow. Sharon Tate's murder was the one subject that could still reduce him to tears, the one tragedy even his bitterest enemies avoided mentioning. "That's enough," Polanski whispered, his composure cracking. "Is it?" Dean asked. "Because I'm just getting started." You see, Sharon was also young, also beautiful, also surrounded by wealth and privilege, and she died because she associated with the wrong people, made the wrong choices, put herself in danger for some bohemian fantasy. Polanski's hands were shaking now. He'd gone from predator to prey in 30 seconds, and everyone could see it happening. "But the difference," Dean said, his voice now loud enough for half the party to hear, "is that I would never stand in a room full of strangers and mock her death for entertainment. I would never reduce her life to a punchline about Hollywood excess. Because unlike you, I understand the difference between tragedy and comedy." The silence was absolute now. Even the waiters had stopped moving. This was the kind of moment that would be whispered about in industry circles for years. The night Dean Martin destroyed Roman Polanski without raising his voice. Polanski tried one last time to salvage his dignity. "Dean, you're overwrought. Grief has clouded your—" "Grief," Dean said, "has clarified everything. It's taught me to recognize the difference between men and parasites, between those who build and those who only tear down, between fathers who bury their children with honor and cowards who mock the dead for applause." He stepped even closer to Polanski, close enough that only the director could hear what he said next. "If you ever speak my son's name again," Dean whispered, "if you ever even think about him in my presence, I will make it my personal mission to ensure that every person in this industry knows exactly what you are. Not the brilliant director, not the tragic artist, but the pathetic little man who gets his kicks mocking dead children to their grieving fathers." Dean stepped back, his voice returning to normal volume. "Irving," he called out, addressing their host without taking his eyes off Polanski. "Thank you for a lovely evening." Irving Lazar, who had seen everything in 40 years of Hollywood parties, could only nod mutely. Dean turned and walked toward the door with the same measured pace. The crowd parted before him. No one spoke, no one moved. They just witnessed a masterclass in dignity, in how to defend the dead without losing one's soul. Roman Polanski stood alone in the center of the room, his brandy forgotten, his face ashen. The circle that had hung on his every word had evaporated. The sophisticated audience that had laughed at his cruel wit now looked at him with disgust. Warren Beatty was the first to move, walking past Polanski without acknowledgement. Then Michael Douglas followed. One by one, the A-list guests began to drift away, leaving him isolated in Irving Lazar's marble foyer. The story of that December night spread through Hollywood like wildfire, but not in the usual way. There were no newspaper articles, no gossip columns. Instead, it passed through the industry's underground networks. The assistant who witnessed it told her boss, who mentioned it to his partner. Within a week, everyone who mattered in Hollywood knew what had happened. They knew Roman Polanski had mocked Dean Martin's dead son, and they knew how Dean had responded. More importantly, they knew which man had maintained his dignity and which had revealed himself to be something smaller. The consequences for Polanski were swift and devastating. Projects lost their financing, actors became unavailable, producers stopped returning calls. The European exile that had seemed temporary became permanent banishment from the industry he'd once dominated. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about that night. When friends asked, he would simply say, "A man said something he shouldn't have said. We discussed it." But those who knew Dean said something had changed after the Lazar party. The crushing grief that had defined him since Dean Paul's death seemed to lift slightly, replaced by something harder but healthier, a sense that he'd honored his son's memory in the most important way possible. The lesson of that December night wasn't about revenge, though justice was served. It wasn't about celebrity power, though that was demonstrated. It was about the difference between wit and wisdom, between cleverness and character, between the man who tears down and the man who stands up. In a town built on illusion, where image mattered more than reality, Dean Martin had chosen truth, and truth, delivered with precision, and backed by genuine moral authority, had proven more powerful than all of Polanski's talent, reputation, and European sophistication. The champagne glass that never reached Dean's lips that night became a symbol. It represented the moment when grief transformed into something stronger, when a broken man discovered he still had the power to protect what mattered most. And in Irving Lazar's mansion, surrounded by the most famous faces in the world, Dean Martin had proven that some things: honor, family, the memory of the dead, were more valuable than fame, more powerful than genius, more enduring than any reputation built on cruelty. The King of Cool had found his voice again, and it was the voice of a father.